Hello everyone and welcome to the Living Well with MS webinar series, Season 5. We are so pleased to be introducing our brand new panel style webinars this year, where we will be bringing to life the Overcoming MS Handbook, Roadmap to Good Health, with the help of expert guest speakers and members of the Overcoming MS community. My name is Laura Crowder. I'm a facilitator at Overcoming MS, as well as a teacher and health coach, and I'm joining you from Cornwall in the UK. In today's webinar, we will be exploring the theme of healthy changes for you and your family, and we'll be welcoming Professor Michelle O'Donoghue and Ambassadors Vickie, Hadge and Halstead to the virtual stage for a panel discussion, hearing about their experiences of today's theme and their top tips. They will also be answering some of your important questions. Before we get started, I'll run through a bit of housekeeping to help keep the webinar running as smoothly as possible for you. You'll notice that the session is being recorded and you'll receive a link via Zoom to access the recording next week. Because this is a Zoom webinar, you will only be able to see the guest speakers. However, it is still an interactive session as you will be able to ask a question using the Q&A tab on your screen. So please do submit your questions and we will hopefully be able to answer them when we get to the Q&A later on. Please note that our expert guest speakers cannot comment or advise on any individual circumstances, so please do try to keep questions generalised. If you do experience any technical problems during the webinar, try exiting your browser and re-entering using the link in your email. We do recommend using a Chrome browser to access today's webinar, as it seems to work better. We have tried to make the webinar session as accessible as possible, and today we are using subtitles, which you may see at the bottom of your screen. You can turn these on and off by clicking the CC Live Transcript option. As you exit the webinar in approximately 1 hour, you will see a short survey pop up automatically, which we would really appreciate your feedback on, as it helps us to shape future webinars and events going forward. So today's webinar covers 2 pillars of the Overcoming MS programme: family health and change your life for life. I was diagnosed with MS in 2018. And as a daughter, sister, wife, auntie, and mother to 2 teenagers, the pillar of family health has been a key part of my Overcoming MS journey. I remember watching the introductory webinar on the OMS Handbook 2 years ago and hearing Professor Jelinek say that before OMS came along, people were not talking about what we might do for the rest of the family to prevent them developing MS, or to consider how your particular journey might affect their journeys through life. For many people, including me, the Overcoming MS programme is life-changing. And as Professor Jelinek says, our journeys affect our families' journeys. What I didn't perhaps realise when I embarked on the programme is that the effect would be such a positive one. In the foreword to the handbook, Linda Bloom describes the OMS programme as a valuable tool for the families and loved ones who are also on this journey. And after 6 years of following the programme, I can definitely say that this has been true for my family. I have to admit, it wasn't the case when I first started the programme, as after learning about the risks of family members, I tried to force changes, particularly dietary ones, on my family, and these weren't always very well received. However, once my family saw the benefits that I was experiencing, they began to make their own healthy changes, not just to their diets, but also to their mindsets. And as a result, the Overcoming MS programme has brought about so many healthy changes for me and my family. 2 chapters in the handbook cover family health specifically. Chapter 16 on pregnancy and childbirth, and Chapter 9 covering families and prevention. The theme of positive change runs throughout the handbook, but in Chapter 19, The Road Ahead, Professor Jelinek writes about how we can integrate the OMS programme into life and describes it as a whole of life change based on the best available science to reduce our risk of progression and to reduce the risk of our loved ones developing the illness. In the preface to the handbook, Professor Michelle O'Donoghue writes about some of the changes the Overcoming MS program has had on her life. And she states that these changes can only lead you to a place of enhanced physical and spiritual health. I'm delighted to say that Michelle is joining us as our expert speaker today. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Professor Michelle O'Donoghue to the virtual stage to speak about healthy changes for you and your family. Hi, Michelle, how are you?
Hi, Laura. I'm delighted to be joining as a panelist. This is a program that I'm very passionate about, and so I really relish the opportunity to be speaking with both our other panelists as well as those who've joined this evening.
Well, we're just delighted to have you. I was just wondering that so that our viewers at home can get to know you a little better, please could you introduce yourself and talk a little bit about your involvement in the Overcoming MS Handbook?
Absolutely. So I live in Boston, where I'm a practicing cardiologist. So I'm not a neurologist, but I am a physician. And I was born in Canada, but I've lived now in Boston for the past couple of decades. Now, I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis when I was in my early 30s. Now, that was around 2010 that I was diagnosed. And I have to say, as a physician, I knew the signs. And it did cross my mind when I was losing vision one day. It was the first time that this had happened. I had been feeling perhaps a little bit run down. And out of the blue, I just started to notice a bit of a veil coming down over my vision on one of my eyes. And it really worsened quite rapidly over the course of the next 1 to 2 days. And when I was waiting to get an MRI, when I went to the hospital to be evaluated, the idea of MS crossed my mind, but I have to say that I never really thought that that would be the diagnosis I was facing. And I think part of that was just a profound fear I had always had of multiple sclerosis. I had only ever known people who'd had really difficult cases as a child. I had known many people who, had bravely faced their future in a wheelchair. But obviously it had many struggles along the way. And of course, there are many people who are otherwise diagnosed with multiple sclerosis who live very healthy lifestyles. And of course, for even those who are in a wheelchair or otherwise have other visible or invisible barriers to daily activity, that there certainly is a path towards improved health. But I think at the time, I was just absolutely terrified of the diagnosis that I was facing. And initially, I was not willing to make a lot of lifestyle changes. It's interesting. I immediately asked the doctor. There was an intuitive part to me that perhaps a diet and lifestyle could be a favorable change that I could make in my life. And so when I was faced with that diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, and let me tell you, I was terrified. I was absolutely terrified. And, you're just meeting me for the first time, but I was sobbing, uncontrollably. It's just such shocking news to receive. And as a physician, perhaps in some ways I knew too much, and the news was discouraging. But I asked the neurologist about changes to my lifestyle that I could make. And he did immediately mention the work of Roy Swank. And for those of you who are quite familiar with the OMS program, you'll know that Dr. Swank had actually set much of the early research work that helped Dr. George Jelinek embark upon his journey towards creating the OMS program. But nonetheless, even though the doctor told me about this information, I really stuck my head in the sand. I had a hard time. I, initially went through a period of denial, then followed by reading a lot of discouraging books that were telling me that, invariably that I was going to be having mobility and other types of problems in the very near future. And I was really quite discouraged. I initially found Dr. Jelinek's book relatively early on. And it's interesting, I picked it up for the first time, started reading it, and it's as though I wasn't quite ready to accept the information. But a few months later, I circled back and I picked that book up again. And, I mentioned that I'm a cardiologist, but I'm actually also a researcher. So I'm somebody who practices what we call evidence-based medicine. I really like to understand the research that goes behind the different recommendations that we offer as physicians. And that's what really ultimately resonated for me with the book. As a doctor, I had not spent much time thinking about diet, even as a cardiologist, which seems so absurd to me now. But it really wasn't part of what we had learned in medical school. Not just that, but the idea of incorporating so many different aspects of healthy living into one's life was again not something that I had spent an awful lot of time thinking about. As a physician, I was busy. I had my head down in the books, and it wasn't really until I started to embrace this concept that there is hope. And this is it's not just grasping at straws, but in fact, it's actually based in science, and there's research to support these decisions. And at that point in time, I really made a headfirst dive into the OMS program and have embraced it ever since. So I've been following the OMS program now for 13 years. And initially, I never thought I could possibly make the type of diet and lifestyle changes that were required, but I've absolutely embraced them. Now, specific to today's focus is really about thinking about family and how the OMS program can build into that. Now, I welcome the stories from the other panelists, as my story is probably a little bit different than theirs. I was diagnosed with MS before I was married. So I was living alone at the time. And I met my husband a few years later. I will admit that initially I was hesitant to tell him even about my diagnosis of MS. I had been living well. And, at the time there was no visible reason that somebody would ask me if I had multiple sclerosis, even though actually the eyesight in one of my eyes never recovered from that initial bout of optic neuritis. But I eventually told my at the time boyfriend, who later became my fiance, and he was absolutely incredibly supportive. And of course, he had already noticed the diet that I was following, but he really immediately wanted to support me any way that he could. And from that point forward, I have to say that it's actually been quite easy for me to have my husband follow an OMS diet. He was a steak and potatoes kind of fellow, but he likes to say that very often a man will just eat what's put in front of him. And I think there's some truth, at least in our house, that I really found recipes that he liked and was able to cook that way at home. And when we go out to restaurants, he will eat whatever he likes on the menu. Although I think now that I've really shaped his vision of health in such a way that he is actually very health conscious in general, in a way that he wasn't before. The second thing that I will note was that I then faced many challenges with fertility. I had gotten married at an older age, and I ended up having to undergo in vitro fertilization. And, as you know, there are many different hormones that are injected to your body during that time. It can be quite the hormonal roller coaster. But when I knew that I was going to have to undergo IVF, that's where I really doubled down on my commitment to healthy living. I really wanted to embrace not just the diet, but also making sure that I was being careful about meditation, exercise, and all sorts of different aspects of healthy living that I could embrace. Then finally, how have I incorporated all of this with my children? So I have a stepson who's 14 years old, and I'm delighted to say that I have a 3-year-old healthy boy who I gave birth to at the age of, I think just a week before I turned 44 years old. So certainly on the older side. And let me tell you first that also during this entire journey over the past 13 to 14 years, even though my disease was very active during that first year after my diagnosis, once I embraced the OMS program, knock on wood, I have lived every day healthily since then. I have not had any evidence of disease recurrence. I actually stopped, for me, it was the right decision to stop my medication for MS at the time that I was trying to become pregnant. And since I've remained healthy, my personal decision has been that I've actually remained off of medication since that time. During my pregnancy, I was very careful again about maintaining my health, but then also thinking about my now son, Jamie, making sure that he was getting vitamin D supplementation. And that's something that I also carried through during the first year of his life as well as beyond. I've also strongly believed in the link between dairy exposure and MS risk. And so that is something that I've been very conscious of. I breastfed for as long as possible during that first year and have really limited any type of dairy exposure whenever possible. As for my stepson, it actually was, again, quite easy in many ways to find ways to balance foods that he liked at the time with my program. And at the time, he was vegetarian as well. And he was less than 10 years old, and so perhaps a little bit easier. You know, I'll admit that it's been more challenging now to come up with a single diet that suits all palates with my 14-year-old stepson now. So he'll often, so to speak, do his own thing. But that's fine. I think, you know, whatever works for your family is ultimately what matters. So again, I don't want to ramble on too long because, you know, I know that we have other panelists that we'd like to hear from. But I would say that, you know, that those have been the key parts of my journey, and I think every journey is very different. But, you know, I think that the most important part for me about the OMS program altogether has been the hope and optimism that it gave me at a time that was really quite dark, in all honesty. And, you know, and I think that it's such a blueprint for healthy living, regardless of whether or not you have multiple sclerosis, that's the part that really clicked for my husband. And he, you know, has been trying to embrace a plant-based diet as much as possible, both for health reasons, as well as he feels passionately about climate change and other reasons like that. So it really ultimately is a win-win. And the last thought that I'll offer too is that as a cardiologist, it has completely reshaped the way that I think about caring for my patients. As I've come to recognize that, of course, diet has such an important impact on cardiovascular disease, which is my area of focus. And so I am now very keen to discuss the advantages of a predominantly plant-based diet with my patients whenever they're interested. So I'll certainly stop there. And Laura, I know that you probably have some questions and some thoughts from the other panelists as well.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was so interesting. And there's so many points that I've got that we can come back to in our panel discussion. For now, I'd like to welcome Vickie to the virtual stage. And interestingly, you ended by talking about the hope and the optimism that the program has offered you, and I couldn't agree more with that. And I think Vickie now is going to speak to us a little bit more about that and about the pillar of change your life for life. So welcome, Vickie.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Well, I'll give you a little bit of background about me and my MS journey. I had my first discernible relapse in 2006, but I wasn't diagnosed at that time. They did suspect MS, but luckily they said, let's take a wait and see approach, but it definitely got my attention. So I actually started changing my diet and lifestyle back in 2006. And I felt much better and didn't have another relapse for 10 years. When I was finally diagnosed in 2017 is when I found the Overcoming MS program. And I was already vegetarian at that point and had already embraced some lifestyle changes. So it was a natural fit for me and also for my family. I was lucky enough that my husband was vegetarian as well. He actually went vegetarian before I did. And you know, the making changes for our family health was very important to me as well. I'm a mom of 2 children, and we naturally worry about our children. So started implementing some changes into the dietary household like Laura. Sometimes they weren't very well received. You can't force it on them, but started implementing more changes into the diet and realized that I wasn't as healthy as I thought I was. When I started reading the research of Roy Swank and George Jelinek and looking at the food that I was eating as a vegetarian, a lot of it was vegetarian junk food, and a lot of it was highly processed and frankenfood and fake foods. So there was a point where I had to embrace even more changes for myself and overcoming the thought of deprivation, the restrictiveness. That was a challenge for me. Thinking that I could never have cream in my coffee again was shocking. I didn't think I could do that, but I was able to do it. And, you know, soon after I started making the changes, I realized that it's not a restrictive diet. There's over 20,000 kinds of edible plants out there, and my diet is more diverse now than it was before I started following the OMS programs. So it has been eye-opening to me to see how much healthier I can be and how much more diverse my diet can be. So it was a little challenging for my extended family. They were really concerned that I was restricting my diet and not getting the nutrients I needed, you know, the protein, fear, and it took a while to bring them along. They were really concerned, but it's been 7+ years that I've been eating this way, and they see how well I'm doing. So everyone's pretty much on board and supportive. You know, for practicality of changing our life for life, sometimes it's not easy. When going to family events or going out to restaurants with others, it can be a challenge. So when I do go to family events, I always offer to bring food, and I bring a main dish and a salad, or a main dish and a dessert to share. So that makes it easier for the host of the event. They don't have to worry so much about what they're going to feed me. And I realized with going out to restaurants, I don't have to go to vegan restaurants. I can go to almost any restaurant that's not a chain restaurant, long as they are actually cooking food, not just heating and serving. And I look at the entrees and I see what side dishes they have for those. And many times I can create a delicious meal just picking the side dishes from the entrees. So that made it much easier to make changes for life. You know, I don't have to restrict going out with friends or celebrating with family. So that was very helpful for me as well. And I think for the vitamin D, that was important. I asked my kids, you know, please start taking vitamin D. It's important for your future health. And I think everybody can benefit from having vitamin D. And one of the other supplements that I do take is B12 because I am vegan. I don't do the fish. And when doing my own reading on it, I found that almost everybody is low in B12, even the omnivores and the meat eaters. So B12 is a supplement that I take as well. Dr. Michelle, being a cardiologist, you might appreciate this. My husband has some heart disease, so we went out to the Cleveland Clinic and we attended the Dr. Esselstyn reverse heart disease with diet program, which was another great thing to do. I encourage everyone to, you know, keep learning and keep going to events and getting educated on the benefits of eating this way. It's not just for MS, it's for overall health. So that's a bit about me and my story. If you have any questions about how we got here and how my family's doing, I'd be happy to answer those.
Thank you so much, Vickie. And yeah, I've definitely got some questions and I can't wait to ask them when we get to the panel. Now I'd like to welcome Anne to share a little bit about her journey.
I hope you can see me.
Yes, we can.
Great. So I was actually worked in health services for many years as a nurse and then as a health visitor, which was with families and focused on family health and health education. So I was a shock to be diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS in 2012, particularly because I had a close family member with MS who was becoming increasingly unwell. I was interested in what healthy lifestyle choices might be out there, but the neurologist I saw told me to not go and look at anything. Don't go and Google MS. And I was in a bit of a state of shock. So I didn't do that. And I regret it now, because I did some digging around eventually and found Professor Swank's studies and listened to what the MS nurses were telling me, which was they advised going on a low saturated fat diet, which they gave me the Swank reference. So I did some digging around in the medical literature, but not to any great extent. And I didn't find OMS because it isn't present in the medical literature. But my close family member was becoming quite disabled. And my daughter actually found an article about OMS. I was working up until around 2017, when I had to stop working part-time as a health visitor because I was the fatigue was becoming difficult at work to manage at work, and I was able to take early retirement. But my daughter found this while I was signed off sick at that time, and I read it and immediately knew that I could do this because I was already doing some of it. And it was the first positive, optimistic thing I had ever seen about MS. I think that was what really spoke to me, was you can do something about it. You can look after yourself. You can help yourself to heal. So I went on, when there was some retreats announced, I went on one in 2018. And became an ambassador for my local area in England, where I live. My family have been very accommodating of my change in diet. My husband and son, adult son, are at home with me. My daughter, who found the programme, lives away. But we have family meals together. Most are completely OMS compliant. So I'm not cooking, when people aren't cooking 2 meals. I don't do all the cooking, my husband and son cook as well. But we do have a meal, probably on a Sunday, where they have another option for their main meal. And we combine, so we can share different parts of the meal, and they can perhaps have some meat or chicken. And I'm having a nut roast, for instance, and we share the vegetables and roast potatoes, or OMS-friendly roast potatoes. So I enjoy cooking, and adapting recipes that I find to be OMS-friendly. My husband and son also find, my daughter's better at finding recipes, I must say. They all cook things that I present to them. I find that to be working for us because everybody can eat together, which I really think is important, that you don't isolate yourself to be different. And I enjoyed what Vickie was saying about having to take food to other people. So to be able to socialise is really important. So taking food, taking a main course when you're going out anywhere, is a great relief to a host or hostess, that I will take something that I can eat, or a dessert that I can eat, but that everybody else can eat too. I find that does work very well. And so, yeah, that is me. I enjoy the cooking, and I enjoy being able to be part of this community. It's tremendously encouraging.
Such a lovely way to finish, Anne. Me too. And speaking of community, I'm hoping that we can welcome back Vickie and Michelle for a discussion now. Hello, ladies.
Hello.
I think it's great. We've got a 3-year-old to adult children with teenagers in between. So lots of interesting challenges there. Perhaps if I could start with you, Michelle. I think such an interesting story, and the way that you're dealing with a 3-year-old and a teenager, hats off to you. I'm not sure, well, I'd be interested actually to hear about any challenges that you find having, you know, such an age difference.
Well, I have to say, you know, Vickie mentioned, for instance, the work of Caldwell Esselstyn in Cleveland. You know, I think that once I started reading more about the benefits of a plant-based diet, it really did open up an entire world where I've learned about the work of some of these other individuals. And actually, I have come to know Dr. Esselstyn quite well along the way, because, you know, I was just very interested to engage in discussions with all these different folks. But the reason I mention it is because it also has really just flipped upside down for me the way that I think about cooking and making meals. You know, I grew up in the typical plate design where there was a piece of meat and there was maybe a vegetable on the side and a potato or something like that. But, you know, now I just think about constructing meals in a different way. And I've just found so many great recipes out there that nobody feels like they're suffering. You know, I sometimes my husband will come with me to just a fantastic vegan restaurant, and he'll say, my goodness, I would eat like this all the time if all restaurants could serve food this way. So I think that one great thing that we have nowadays too is that grocery stores have terrific labels on products. It's much easier to know what you're buying. And the internet has been such a tremendous resource for being able to pull together recipes. You know, so I know that my stepson, for instance, likes the pasta, the pizza. I can easily make those meals when he's with us. My son, my 3-year-old son, it's interesting. He's grown up so much on a plant-based diet that when somebody offers him meat, he finds the texture very odd, and so he doesn't even want to have it. But you know, we just make it work.
I think that's brilliant. And I think I mentioned in my introduction that I initially tried to force changes on my children. I think they were 11 and 8 at the time. And as you said, giving them a bit more ownership. You know, my daughter now, she absolutely loves finding recipes. And she's always saying, Mum, I found a new recipe. I think her latest one was Kung Pao cauliflower, which I never would have thought she would have chosen in a million years, but it was amazing. And also, like you say, maybe trying to make OMS friendly versions of their favorite food, like you say with your stepson, the pizza and pasta. Yeah. Anne and Vickie, have you got anything to add to that? Any tips with your own children that have worked for you?
Yeah, with my family, you know, many times when I'm talking to people about feeding my family, people say, "Oh, how do you cook 2 meals?" And it's not 2 meals. It's one meal with maybe, you know, my son is now vegetarian, but he wasn't before, and I would put a piece of chicken on for him or a piece of meat on for him. So it was one meal with a side of meat. So it wasn't a lot of extra cooking. And, you know, I think a lot of people think vegan food is very different from the standard American or Western diet, and it's not. You know, I think it was Michelle that said, you know, no, it was Anne who said the roasted potatoes, as long as they're OMS friendly or vegan friendly potatoes, they're potatoes. So for me, it wasn't really challenging. I didn't have the mindset of 2 separate meals. It was a meal with a little bit extra for the omnivores in the house.
Yeah, like Anne describes, I love that, you know, the combination that you know, your family might have some meat, but you share the vegetables and still share those all important family meal times, which I think is great. And I loved what you said, Vickie, about the thinking at first, how can I cope without cream in my coffee? Because I was exactly like that about cheese and chocolate. They were my two favorite foods. I was like, how am I ever going to survive without them? And now I look back and I think, gosh, I just didn't understand. And again, I enjoy eating, you know, following the Overcoming MS diet. Now, if I was told I didn't have an MS, I would carry on following it because I love it. So
I think it was for me being able to do a meal that can be mixed and matched with people's preferences. But what was so interesting was that at Christmas, the family wanted to have some roast turkey, which was absolutely fine. I made a nut roast. All the vegetables were OMS friendly, but everybody wanted my nut roast as well as the turkey because it looked so nice and it was herby and interesting. So yeah, you can get them on, and they were on board anyway. But yeah, make it really interesting, and people will want to try it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be an experience of deprivation. I think that that's one of the great things about eating this way is that really you can eat as much as you want. In you know, in many ways, when you're eating plants, that there's no real limit. In the same way as when you're eating a traditional diet. And yeah, there just is so much selection. But like you said, you know what, when I'm making American Thanksgiving dinner for my family here in the US, I will roast a turkey for them. But I have generally found that, first of all, I have no interest in the turkey anymore whatsoever. But, you know, I just have a wonderful array of different vegan side dishes, and that's what everyone gravitates towards.
Fantastic. Have you had any challenges, would you say, that you've had to overcome with your families? I know, Michelle, you said that your fiance and then husband was obviously very quick to follow the Overcoming MS, well, at least the diet anyway, and very interested in the lifestyle. How about you, Anne and Vickie? Any challenges that you've had with family, introducing the program to them?
What I found interesting was that my brother, who was a doctor, had heard of SWANK. Has become increasingly disabled with MS, and really, you know, dismissed it when I said this is what I was doing, and I've just found that really sad. And so my family are aware of the situation with the family, and that we can. This is what we can do something about it, and it's positive. And they pretty much go along with it, with obviously with the food, but they're both taking vitamin. Both my children are taking vitamin D. They both exercise regularly. I'm not sure about the meditation.
I did have initially the first few years that I was making the changes, my extended family was concerned. They thought I was eating much too restrictive, and they thought that I was missing things out of my diet. And you know, even some would say, oh, the doctors say there's no such thing as an MS diet. And there was initial resistance. They thought I was doing myself harm instead of doing good for myself. And I had to just keep reassuring them. I know that they were voicing concerns because they liked me and they loved me. So it was, initially it was hard when they would make comments about how restrictive my diet was, because many times, especially in the beginning, I would have to say, no, I can't have the potatoes because there's butter in them. Or no, I can't have that dish because it's got cheese on it. Although, like you, I missed cheese at the beginning quite a bit. So there initially was some hesitancy on my family's part, and they were concerned. But we've all become educated along the way, and now they see how well I am living with my MS and how well I am overall health-wise. And they've come a long way and are doing well with it now.
I think that's incredible. I think it's Karen Law in the handbook mentions being a role model of health. And I think certainly in my personal experience that when I stopped trying to force the changes and focused instead on making those changes in my life, that's when the kids especially saw, you know, how my life was transforming for the better. And I think that probably encouraged them to make their own changes. My daughter is, well, she's completely dairy free across the board, pretty much follows the Overcoming MS program, give or take a few treats every now and then, treats as she would call them, not as I would call them. And my son is dairy free when he's at home. But one thing I did find with them is after I introduced them to the program, they again had this perception. So many people have this perception, don't they, that there's deprivation and missing out. And they would say things to me like, Mum, can you eat this? And if I said yes, they'd be like, oh, I don't want it. I'm not eating that. If you can eat it, I don't want it. And I just was so disheartened. And then in the end, I know it's a little bit sneaky, but I would actually make things and I would say to them, oh, no, this isn't something I eat. It's not part of the Overcoming MS program. And they would sit down, they would tuck into like some black bean brownies or something like that. And they'd be loving them and say, can I have another one? And then I'd sit down and eat one with them. And it just was a really good way of showing them that it's actually delicious and there is nothing wrong with eating a plant-based whole food diet. So, yeah.
Well, it's funny with the physicians that I work with here, when I first started following a plant-based diet, you know, they really made fun of me. These are trained physicians, but they didn't believe in the science initially. But it's interesting that this same group of individuals have done a complete 180 on that. They absolutely are strongly supportive now of, you know, the diet and lifestyle that I follow. And not just that, they're also referring people to me, both with heart disease as well as diagnosis of multiple sclerosis, to have chats with them about lifestyle changes that they could make as well. So it's interesting. I think that there is always a lot of skepticism. But the key, I think, really is to stick with it. You know, what's challenging for a lot of people that I've spoken with who have a new diagnosis of MS, or even who have had it for a long, long time, is that there's so much out there on the internet that appears to be conflicting. And, you know, they say, gosh, I read about this diet or that diet, and I'm just confused. I'm not going to do anything at all. Or alternatively, I'll hear about people who will say, I followed it for 3 months and nothing seemed different. So, you know, so I stopped. And, you know, I just really want to encourage people that one, I really think that the OMS program is based in real science. It's beneficial not only for an autoimmune condition, but I truly believe probably for most illnesses that are prevalent in our society, a large number of them are probably diet-based in some way, shape, or form, or are sort of fueled along by diet, certainly. So I would really encourage people to think about, if they're going to do this, to sort of try to do it all in. I know that people talk about sort of putting their toe in the water, and that's fine to start, but I think it's something that you really need to embrace. And, you know, and I think Vickie and Anne, like you've said as well, and Laura, that once you really make the dietary change, for instance, your palate changes with it eventually. You know, if you put a piece of steak in front of you at this point, I would have no interest in it whatsoever. What you find appetizing just ends up changing over time.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm hoping that we can move over. We've actually got quite a lot of questions from our audience. So I've just been having a quick look through them. Mark has asked, he said, the panelists so far appear to have relapsing remitting MS and the positive effects of following OMS. Is there anyone with PPMS, primary progressive MS, who has found any positives from Overcoming MS? So I've got the handbook here, which we're basing our webinars on this series. And chapter 8, written by Dr. Philip Startin, Phil, is one of our Overcoming MS facilitators with progressive MS. And his chapter is fantastic and will hopefully be able to answer your questions about how following Overcoming MS helps with progressive MS. We have another question from Sandra. She says, if you go out for dinner in a vegan restaurant, do you use the OMS chef card? Anyone any experience of using the chef cards?
I have to admit, I have not been using the chef card, but I am very specific about asking for, you know, what I need in a meal. So even at a vegan restaurant, I think the thing to really be most alert to is use of things like coconut oil, coconut cream. There's some things like that that are very high in saturated fat that would not be part of the OMS diet. And so a lot of sort of creamy-based vegan meals may be high in saturated fat. So that would be one thing in particular to look for.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I don't use the cards. I am aware of what is in the foods, and I will ask specifically about ingredients. When I was first diagnosed, one of the things that I did, as well as met with a nutritionist and talked about diet, and one of the questions I asked her is like, how good do I have to be? And we came up with a plan where we said, okay, let's aim for 90%. And I do enjoy going out to eat, and I do enjoy going out with my friends, but it's a very small portion of my overall diet. And if there is a little bit of oil that's used in the cooking, I don't sweat it. I am very strict on the dairy and the coconut creams and the high saturated fats. I think fats are a very important part of our diet, but the saturated fats I keep as low as possible. So I don't sweat a little bit of oil when I'm out at restaurants.
Yeah, I certainly.
I tend to tell the restaurant in advance. But look, what I found best is to look at the menu and say, can you do this dish with making an adjustment to it? I found that works better than trying to bombard them with, this is my diet, because that they're busy, and to try and understand our diet does take a little while. So if I say to them, can you do this fish but grilled instead of fried, and with an alternative on the side instead of chips or whatever, and that works very well. And of course I do have particular places that I know work better for me locally. So that's always good, because then you're returning customers, so then they get to know you.
Yeah, that's good advice about the local restaurants. I have used the chef cards when we've been going to a restaurant in advance and emailed it, and they've had a really positive response so far, actually. So just in case anyone was wondering. Sorry, Michelle.
Oh, no, not at all, Laura. I was just going to mention that when I'm not at a vegan restaurant, which is most of the time, I usually say I have a dairy allergy, because I have generally found that if you just try to explain it, that they may not take it seriously. Whereas a lot of restaurants now have much more strict allergen protocols in place. And I truly do view us with MS as having a dairy allergy, essentially, because I really quite passionately feel that there is a strong link there between dairy consumption and autoimmune illnesses.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. Heidi's asking what quantity of vitamin D you take as a supplement.
What quantity or what kind?
Quantity, yes.
Okay, so I get my blood work done every 6 months, and I adjust my vitamin D as necessary. We're still in winter time. I'm in Connecticut in the United States, so we're still deep in winter time. So I am currently at 5,000 international units a day. And the brand is Pure brand on the recommendation of my doctor.
I'm taking 6,000 units just because the drops I have are they're in extra virgin olive oil as an oil, and I just drop those into a glass of juice in the morning, orange juice in the morning. So that worked really well for me rather than taking a pill. I stick on about 4,000 to 6,000 units and try to get a blood test done, but our GPs are a little reluctant to do those because they're expensive.
Yeah, I think it really does depend on the person and their genetics, because, you know, I'm somebody who, when I was diagnosed with MS, was found to be vitamin D deficient. And I have found that I need very high levels of supplements to maintain, you know, even just normal vitamin D levels. So I think that that's just sort of a genetic oddity for, you know, for me. It depends on whether it's summer or winter, how much vitamin D I think I'm getting from the sunlight, but I take up to 15,000 IUs per day. I wouldn't just encourage people to do that without knowing their levels, but for me, that still doesn't bring my levels into a very high range.
I think it's really good advice, actually, to get levels checked if you can. I take 10,000 IU pretty much all year, really, because unfortunately Cornwall isn't the sunniest place in the world anymore. But thank you ever so much. Okay, there's a question here from Judy about professionals who advocate a paleo or keto diet for MS, which is a dairy and wheat-free version of the paleo keto diet. Has anyone got any comments about that?
I'll comment about that. I have looked into a lot of the different diets. You can see my bookshelf behind me. Those are all health-related books, and I've looked into a lot of the different diets, and what I've found is they have more in common than they do different. Most of the diets that support MSers are really high in vegetable intake, really high in whole foods, and get rid of processed foods, get rid of junk foods, preservative hormones, antibiotics, things like that. So if you look at all the diets, I would say that they have more in common than different. I do believe the recommendations of OMS have the most research behind them in looking at them, and it comes down to personal choice in the end, but I do believe the OMS recommendations have the best research behind it.
Thank you. And Eleni asks about maintaining weight. She says she follows a modified OMS diet, mainly avoiding saturated fats, but has found it hard to maintain a strict diet with no eggs, chicken for protein and maintain weight. So she'd like any similar experiences or tips on how to maintain weight.
Yeah, I'm somebody who's always been on the leaner side. And I think that I had sort of mistaken that in my earlier years as a green light to eat any way that I wish. You know, and I think that that's a mistake that people sometimes make when they're lean, is that they don't spend as much time focusing on healthy intake necessarily. But I think that my metabolism has since shifted, so I'm not in the same position where I'm trying to put on weight. But you know, I think that there is opportunity with sort of healthier fats to keep the weight on, even without having to consume a large volume of food. Certainly with, you know, like nuts and avocados, certain types of legumes, that there certainly is the opportunity to bring lots of healthy fats into your diet, and that can help, you know, with keeping weight on if you need to. And on the flip side, those are sort of the foods you may want to keep out of your diet if you're having trouble in the opposite direction.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. Shortly after my diagnosis, I took a course in plant-based nutrition through eCornell just to help me with my overall knowledge. And you know, a lot of the foods that we are consuming are lower in calorie density. So if we're losing weight, we can add back whole grains, oats, and amaranth, and a lot of legumes like chickpeas are very calorie dense, so add some of those back, and the nuts and the seeds. So looking for those more calorie dense foods and adding those, upping those a little bit more.
Thank you. We've got another question here from Hayley, who says, what is the best way to go about figuring out which foods cause your symptoms to flare up? Possibly, as a health coach, I would be advising someone to be possibly keeping a food diary and seeing if they can find any connection with their flare-ups. I don't know if anyone else has got any other suggestions for that one. Okay. Do people with MS, despite being on the Overcoming MS program for many years, experience any physical weakness in their body? That's from Tanya.
Yeah, I do. My MS affects primarily the left side of my body. And I do have sensation loss and weakness on the left. And part of how I manage with that, it is what I would consider at this point permanent damage. There is scar tissue on my nerves, but the exercise portion and moving our bodies regularly really helps with that. After my first relapse in 2006, I had foot drop, and I worked really hard physically to get that back. And it took months and months and months. And yoga was very, very helpful for me. And I really believe that neuroplasticity can really help with that. The more that we keep trying to move, the brain has the ability to rewire with neuroplasticity. So I think that the physical part of the OMS program is really important when it comes to having the weakness. And, also acknowledging that, maybe there is permanent damage, and that's okay. I know so many people now in the MS community who live such full and rich lives, even though they use mobility aids. They have a weakness, or they have a challenge and they use an aid to overcome that challenge.
And I think it's important. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Anne.
Sorry. I think I have become, my symptoms have increased in the last few years. But yes, it doesn't stop the living a full life and doing the things that you can do rather than mourning the things you can't do. That's what I've found. I need to switch. So instead of being able to go on long walks, I sing more because I can sing. I sing in 3 choirs now. So looking at the positives and celebrating what you can do, but it can be frustrating, and I'm probably going into secondary progressive MS apparently, rather than relapsing remitting. But the diagnosis is sort of not a set diagnosis really, but actually celebrating what you can do, I find, is helpful.
I think Anne, you hit upon important points, though, is that it's important for people to realize that the OMS program is not, we're not touting it as a cure, for the disease, but rather it's about, one, living your best life, no matter how you want to define it, independent of multiple sclerosis. And then I think that there is firm science to suggest that it will slow the rate of relapses, and for many, it may completely halt relapses altogether. Now, everyone's going to be a little bit different, but I think that people shouldn't become too discouraged if they start following the OMS program and they still end up having a relapse during that time, or they slide into secondary progressive, or for those with primary progressive, you don't know exactly what the slope or what the frequency would have looked like if you were not on that program. But any way you look at it, you're living your best life by following this type of an approach.
Oh, I think that's a fantastic way. Unfortunately, we've run out of time and we haven't managed to answer all the questions, but such a positive way to end. And I just want to say a huge thank you to you all, Professor Michelle O'Donoghue, Vickie, and thank you so much for being a part of our first webinar of the new Living Well with MS season. There's just a couple of final points from me. You'll receive a link to access the recording of the webinar next week via Zoom. And please do try and fill out the automatic survey, which will pop up after this webinar, to provide your feedback, as it really does help shape future webinars. Also, we'll be back on Sunday, the 17th of March at 7 p.m. with our next webinar, giving you the chance to ask questions to a neurologist. And you can visit the events page on the Overcoming MS website to register for that webinar. Thank you everyone for joining, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you.